There was a time when the galaxy burned not from the outside, but from within. When the greatest sons of humanity turned their weapons not against alien horrors or the nameless dark, but against their own father. The Horus Heresy was not simply a rebellion. It was a fracture in the soul of the Imperium, a wound so deep that 10,000 years later, the Imperium still bleeds from it. Before the heresy, the Emperor walked among his sons, and they were conquerors without equal. They brought worlds to compliance, shattered alien empires, and united humanity under the light of the imperial truth. But ambition, pride, and the whispers of powers older than stars poisoned that vision. Brother turned against brother. Legions that had fought side by side for centuries met on killing fields drenched in the blood of their own kind. And at the center of it all stood Horus Lupercal, the Warmaster, the favored son who dared to strike at the very heart of Terra itself. This is the story of how the dream died, how heroes became monsters, and how the Imperium learned that the greatest threat to humanity was not the Xenos, but the darkness that lives in every human heart. If this story grips you the way it grips me, if you feel the weight of what was lost and the horror of what came after, then join me on this journey through the ashes of the Imperium's brightest age. Hit that like button, share this with anyone who loves deep lore and epic tragedy, and subscribe so you never miss another chapter of the galaxy's darkest hours. We are about to walk through the fires of betrayal, and I want you with me every step of the way. There are moments in history that shine so brightly they blind us to the shadows gathering at the edges. The Great Crusade was one such moment. For nearly 2 centuries, the fleets of the Imperium had pushed outward from Terra, reclaiming lost human colonies, toppling alien empires, and bringing the light of the imperial truth to the darkest corners of the galaxy. It was an age of heroes, an age when the impossible became routine and the galaxy itself seemed to bend to humanity's will. At the heart of this expansion stood 20 demigods, the Primarchs, sons of the Emperor of mankind, each one a legend in the making. They commanded legions of space marines, warriors whose very existence defied nature, whose loyalty was absolute, and whose prowess in battle was unmatched. And above them all stood the Emperor himself, a being so vast in power and vision that even his sons could not fully comprehend him. But divinity does not guarantee wisdom, and power does not ensure unity. The Primarchs were not machines. They were men, or something greater than men, and within each of them burned the fires of ambition, pride, jealousy, and doubt. Some loved the Emperor as a father. Others respected him as a ruler but resented his distance, his silence, his refusal to share the full scope of his plans. And a few, deep in their hearts, harbored darker feelings still. The Emperor had created them as tools of war, instruments of conquest, and when the crusade ended, what purpose would they have? What place would warriors have in a galaxy finally at peace? These were the questions whispered in the silence between campaigns, in the shadows of command decks, in the minds of beings who had been designed to conquer but not to rest. The Emperor, in his infinite foresight, had seen the need for secrecy. He kept projects hidden, even from his sons. He built the webway beneath the Imperial Palace, a means to free humanity from the perils of warp travel, but he told no one. He left the crusade in the hands of Horus Lupercal, the greatest of the Primarchs, and returned to Terra to work in isolation. And in that isolation, in that silence, the seeds of betrayal found fertile ground. Horus Lupercal was the very image of what the Emperor had hoped to create. Tall, broad, his face both noble and fierce, his presence commanding instant loyalty from all who met him. He was a natural leader, beloved by his Luna Wolves Legion, respected by his brother Primarchs, and trusted absolutely by the Emperor. When the Emperor named him Warmaster, granting him command of the entire Great Crusade, none questioned the choice. If anyone could carry the Emperor's vision forward, it was Horus. He fought not for personal glory but for the dream of a united humanity. He mediated disputes between his brothers, kept the crusade on course, and pushed the frontiers of the Imperium ever outward. But even Horus, for all his strength, was not immune to doubt. The Emperor's departure weighed on him. He had been at his father's side for decades, learning, growing, becoming the general and statesman the Imperium needed. And then, without warning, the Emperor withdrew. He left Horus in command of hundreds of thousands of space marines, entire battle fleets, the loyalty of his brother Primarchs, and the fate of countless worlds. It was an honor beyond measure, but it was also a burden that crushed the soul. And in the rare moments when Horus was alone, when the weight of command pressed down on him like the gravity of a dying star, he wondered if he had been abandoned. Not replaced, not dismissed, but simply left behind. The crusade continued. Worlds fell into compliance. Alien empires were shattered. The Imperium grew. But something had changed. The unity that had once defined the Primarchs began to fracture. Arguments broke out over tactics, over doctrine, over the treatment of conquered populations. Some Primarchs advocated for the extermination of all non-compliant cultures. Others believed in integration, in allowing human colonies to retain elements of their old ways so long as they swore loyalty to the Emperor. Horus tried to mediate, tried to hold his brothers together, but the divisions were deepening. And all the while, forces older and darker than the Imperium were watching. The ruinous powers, the four great gods of chaos, had taken notice of the Great Crusade. They saw the Primarchs not as tools of the Emperor, but as potential champions. Beings of such psychic might, such emotional intensity, such ambition and pride, were exactly the kind of souls that the warp could corrupt. But they needed a foothold. They needed doubt, pain, resentment. They needed a crack in the armor of the Imperium's greatest son. And on the moon of Davin, they found it. Horus had led an expedition to bring a world called Davin into compliance. The world had fallen to the worship of dark powers, and its warriors, led by a former imperial commander named Temba, had become twisted by the influence of chaos. Horus, confident and eager to purge this corruption personally, descended to the moon where Temba's forces had taken refuge inside an ancient, decaying fortress. The battle was brutal, the air thick with the stench of decay and the hum of warp energy. And in the chaos of combat, Temba struck. His blade, a weapon steeped in the power of Nurgle, the chaos god of plague and decay, bit deep into Horus's flesh. The wound should have been nothing. Horus was a Primarch, a being whose body could heal from injuries that would kill a dozen men. But this was no ordinary wound. The blade carried with it the touch of the warp, a poison that seeped into Horus's blood, into his soul. He collapsed, his body racked with fever, his mind slipping into darkness. His sons carried him back to his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, and laid him in the medicine bay. The apothecaries did everything they could, but the wound would not close. Horus's body, that perfect engine of war, was failing. And as his body died, his spirit was dragged into a realm of nightmare. In the warp, in the domain of the chaos gods, Horus stood alone. The visions came quickly, each one more poisonous than the last. He saw the Emperor seated on a golden throne, no longer the warrior who had fought beside his sons, but a god worshipped by billions, his face distant and cold. He saw temples raised in the Emperor's name, priests chanting prayers, the imperial truth abandoned in favor of blind faith. He saw the Primarchs cast aside, their deeds forgotten, their sacrifices meaningless. He saw himself, the Warmaster who had conquered half the galaxy, reduced to a footnote in the history of the Imperium. And the voices of the Chaos Gods whispered in his ear. They told him that the Emperor had never loved him. That he was a tool, nothing more, created to serve a purpose and then discarded. They told him that the Emperor sought godhood, that he had always sought it, and that the Great Crusade was merely a means to gather the faith and worship he needed to ascend. They told him that his brothers would be cast aside, that the warriors who had bled for the Imperium would be forgotten, and that all their suffering, all their sacrifice, would mean nothing. And they offered him an alternative. Power. Freedom. The chance to reshape the galaxy as he saw fit, to become a god in his own right, to cast down the Emperor and take his place. Horus, in his pain, in his fever, in his doubt, listened. And when he opened his eyes, when the apothecaries pulled him back from the edge of death, he was no longer the same. His wound had healed, but something inside him had broken. The Warmaster, the Emperor's most trusted son, had become a traitor. And the galaxy would burn for it. The change in Horus was subtle at first. Those closest to him noticed a shift in his demeanor, a coldness in his gaze that had not been there before. He spoke less of unity and more of autonomy. He questioned the emperor's decisions, not openly, but in private councils with his most trusted advisors. He began to surround himself with those who shared his doubts, who whispered that the emperor had betrayed them, that the Imperium demanded too much and gave too little in return. And slowly, carefully, Horus began to test the loyalties of his brother Primarchs. He did not approach them all at once. That would have been too obvious, too dangerous. Instead, he reached out to those he knew harbored grievances, those who felt overlooked or undervalued. Fulgrim of the Emperor's children, obsessed with perfection and frustrated by the constraints of imperial doctrine. Angron of the World Eaters, rage incarnate, a warrior who had never forgiven the Emperor for refusing to save his fellow gladiators on his homeworld. Mortarion of the Death Guard, who despised the use of psychers and resented the Emperor's reliance on the warp. Lorgar of the Word Bearers, who had been publicly humiliated by the Emperor for worshipping him as a god. And Magnus the Red of the Thousand Suns, whose pursuit of forbidden knowledge had already set him on a collision course with the imperial truth. Horus spoke to each of them in private, in quiet moments when the weight of the crusade pressed down on them all. He did not demand their allegiance. He simply planted seeds of doubt, reminded them of their grievances, and suggested that perhaps the Emperor was not the father they had believed him to be. He showed them the visions the Chaos Gods had shown him, visions of a future where they were forgotten, where their legions were disbanded, where their sacrifices meant nothing. And one by one, they began to listen. Fulgrim was the first to fall. He had always been vain, always obsessed with achieving perfection in all things. But perfection is a cruel mistress, and the pursuit of it can drive even the strongest soul to madness. On the world of Laren, Fulgrim's legion encountered a Xenos race whose culture was built around the worship of excess and sensation. The Emperor's children crushed them, but Fulgrim claimed a sword from the ruins, a blade that sang with the power of Slaanesh, the chaos god of pleasure and excess. The sword whispered to him, fed his vanity, twisted his desire for perfection into a hunger for sensation that could never be satisfied. And when Horus reached out to him, Fulgrim was already lost. Angron needed no convincing. He had never truly been loyal to the Emperor. The Emperor had taken him from his homeworld, from his fellow gladiators, at the moment of their final stand. Angron had wanted to die beside them, to share their fate, but the Emperor had denied him even that. He had implanted the butcher's nails, crude neural implants that turned him into a living weapon, into Angron's skull, and the rage they brought consumed him. When Horus told him that they would tear down the Imperium, that they would make the Emperor suffer, Angron laughed. It was the first time in decades that he had felt anything close to joy. Mortarion's fall was slower, more reluctant. He hated the warp, hated psychers, hated anything that smacked of the supernatural. But he hated the Emperor's hypocrisy more. The Emperor preached reason and science, yet he wielded powers no mortal could comprehend. He claimed to be building a secular Imperium, yet he surrounded himself with secrets and lies. When Horus offered Mortarion the chance to strike at the Emperor, to prove that even the so-called master of mankind could be brought low, Mortarion's resentment overcame his caution. He pledged his death guard to the traitor cause, though he did not yet realize the full price of that allegiance. Lorgar had been waiting for this moment his entire life. He had worshipped the Emperor as a god, built temples in his name, spread the faith of the imperial creed across the galaxy. And the Emperor had responded by ordering Lorgar's greatest city burned to ash, by forcing him and his entire legion to kneel in the dirt while the Ultramarines stood watch. Lorgar had been broken that day, but he had not been destroyed. Instead, he had turned his gaze inward, into the warp, and discovered the truth the Emperor had tried to hide. There were gods, real gods, and they were far more worthy of worship than the distant, cold tyrant on Terra. When Horus came to him, Lorgar smiled. He had been preparing for this war for decades. Magnus the Red was the most tragic of all. He had done nothing wrong, or so he believed. He had pursued knowledge, delved into the warp, and mastered sorcery to protect humanity, not harm it. But when he discovered Horus's betrayal, when he saw the future unfolding before him, he tried to warn the Emperor. He cast a spell of such power that it shattered the psychic wards protecting the Imperial Palace, tore through the webway project the Emperor had been building in secret, and nearly doomed humanity in the process. The Emperor, furious and heartbroken, sent Leman Russ and the Space Wolves to bring Magnus to Terra for judgment. But Horus intercepted the order, twisted it, and Russ arrived on Prospero not to arrest Magnus, but to destroy him. The Thousand Sons fought back, and in the flames of their burning homeworld, Magnus realized that there was no going back. The Emperor had abandoned him. And if the Emperor would not forgive, then Magnus would embrace damnation. With half the Primarchs turned, Horus began to plan his war in earnest. He could not simply march on Terra. The Loyalist legions were still too strong, too numerous. He needed to cripple them first, to scatter them, to ensure that when the final blow came, there would be no one left to defend the Emperor. And so he laid a trap at Isstvan III. He sent 4 legions to the world, ostensibly to put down a rebellion. But 3 of those legions, the Emperor's children, the World Eaters, and the Death Guard, had already turned traitor. And within each legion, there were still Loyalists, Space Marines who had not yet been told of Horus's betrayal. Horus ordered the traitor elements of the legions to the surface, along with the Loyalists, and then he gave the order. The fleet opened fire. Virus bombs fell from the sky, unleashing a plague that consumed all life on Isstvan III in minutes. The atmosphere ignited, turning the planet into a burning pyre. Millions of Space Marines died in an instant, Loyalists and traitors alike, and those who survived were hunted down in the ruins by their own brothers. But Horus was not finished. The massacre at Isstvan III sent a signal across the galaxy. The Warmaster had turned traitor. The Imperium was at war with itself. And the Emperor, still on Terra, still isolated, still working in secret, did not yet understand the full scope of the disaster. By the time he realized what had happened, it was too late. The traitor legions had already begun their march toward Terra, and the galaxy was drowning in blood. The news of Isstvan III spread like wildfire through the Imperium, but it was not believed. How could it be? Horus Lupercal, the Warmaster, the Emperor's most trusted son, a traitor? It was unthinkable. Surely there had been a mistake, a miscommunication, a rogue faction within the traitor legions that Horus himself would soon purge. The Emperor dispatched 7 Loyalist legions to Isstvan V to confront Horus and bring him back into the fold. The Raven Guard, the Salamanders, the Iron Hands, the Iron Warriors, the Night Lords, the Alpha Legion, and the Word-Bearers assembled in orbit above the traitor stronghold, and the greatest minds of the Imperium believed that the rebellion would be crushed before it truly began. But they did not know that 4 of those 7 legions had already pledged themselves to Horus. The Isstvan V Drop Site Massacre was the moment the Imperium realized the full scale of the betrayal. The Raven Guard, Salamanders, and Iron Hands descended to the surface in a coordinated assault, expecting support from the Iron Warriors, Night Lords, Alpha Legion, and Word-Bearers. But as they pushed forward, as they engaged the traitor forces, the 4 so-called Loyalist legions turned their guns on them. The sky rained fire. Bolter rounds tore through power armor. Chainswords bit into the bodies of brothers who had fought side by side for decades. The Loyalists, caught in a crossfire, were slaughtered. The Iron Hands Primarch, Ferrus Manus, charged forward in rage and was cut down by Fulgrim, his own brother, his head severed and held aloft as a trophy. The Salamanders were scattered, their Primarch Vulcan lost in the chaos. The Raven Guard, led by Corvus Corax, managed a desperate retreat, but their numbers were shattered. 3 legions had been broken in a single day, and the galaxy trembled. With the Loyalists crippled, Horus turned his attention to the wider Imperium. He could not march directly on Terra, not yet. The Emperor still had the Ultramarines, the largest of all the legions, and Robert Guilliman, their Primarch, was a master strategist. If Guilliman brought his forces to bear, the traitor cause could be crushed before it truly began. And so Horus sent Lorgar and the Word-Bearers to delay him. They lured the Ultramarines into the Kolth system and launched a surprise attack, crippling Guilliman's fleet and trapping his forces on the surface. The Ultramarines fought back with characteristic discipline, but they were pinned down, forced to fight a grinding war of attrition while Horus advanced on Terra unopposed. Other loyalist forces fared no better. The Dark Angels, led by Lionel Johnson, were scattered across the galaxy, hunting down traitor strongholds. The Space Wolves, still reeling from their assault on Prospero, were ambushed by the Alpha Legion and nearly destroyed. The Blood Angels and their Primarch Sanguinius were cut off from Terra, forced to take the long route through the warp, and by the time they arrived, the war would already be at its climax. The Emperor's carefully constructed legions, the greatest military force humanity had ever fielded, were being dismantled piece by piece. And all the while, the traitor forces grew stronger. For Horus had made pacts with the Chaos Gods, and they rewarded him. His warriors were no longer merely space marines. They were something darker, something twisted by the energies of the warp. The World Eaters descended into mindless berserker rage, slaughtering anything in their path, friend or foe. The Emperor's children became addicted to sensation, to pain and pleasure in equal measure, and their battles turned into grotesque displays of excess. The Death Guard, betrayed by their first captain Typhon, found themselves trapped in the warp, rotting from the inside out, until Mortarion himself knelt before Nurgle and pledged his soul in exchange for his legion's survival. The Thousand Sons, their bodies reduced to dust by the psychic backlash of their sorcery, became nothing more than hollow suits of armor animated by the will of their sorcerers. Each traitor legion was transformed, granted power beyond imagining, but the cost was their humanity. And yet, not all the traitors embraced chaos willingly. Some, like Perturabo of the Iron Warriors, saw the Chaos Gods as tools to be used, nothing more. Perturabo had spent the entirety of the Great Crusade performing the thankless tasks no one else wanted. While other Primarchs claimed glory in grand campaigns, Perturabo's Iron Warriors had been sent to siege after siege, grinding down fortifications, bleeding and dying in the trenches while their brothers basked in fame. Perturabo resented the Emperor for it, resented his brother Primarchs for their arrogance, and when Horus offered him the chance to prove his worth, to bring low the enemies who had overlooked him, Perturabo joined the rebellion. But he did not kneel before the Dark Gods. He saw them as just another weapon in his arsenal, and he believed, foolishly, that he could use them without being used in turn. The traitor advance was inexorable. World after world fell before them. Some were conquered, their populations enslaved or slaughtered. Others turned willingly, embracing the promises of the Chaos Gods, trading the cold rationality of the imperial truth for the dark ecstasy of worship. And as the traitor fleets drew closer to Terra, the Imperium began to understand the full horror of what was coming. This was not a rebellion that could be negotiated with, not a political dispute that could be settled through diplomacy. This was an existential war, a fight for the very soul of humanity. And the Emperor, still entombed within the Imperial Palace, still working on the Webway project that he had hoped would save humanity, was running out of time. He summoned Rogel Dorn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, and tasked him with fortifying Terra. Dorn, the master of defensive warfare, set to work immediately. He transformed the Imperial Palace into the greatest fortress in the history of the galaxy. He built walls 100 meters thick, gun emplacements that could level entire armies, void shields that could withstand orbital bombardment. He called in every regiment of the Astra Militarum, every knight household, every Titan legion that could reach Terra in time. He armed the citizens, drilled them in basic combat, and prepared the throne world for the siege that he knew was coming. But even Dorn, for all his genius, knew that it might not be enough. The traitors were bringing the full weight of half the Imperium's military might to bear, and they were fueled by the power of gods. Sanguinius and the Blood Angels arrived just in time. They had fought their way through the warp, through ambushes and demonic incursions, and they reached Terra battered but unbroken. Sanguinius, the angel, the most beloved of all the Primarchs, stood beside Dorn and swore that he would hold the walls or die trying. He knew, deep in his soul, that he would not survive the siege. He had seen his own death in visions, had seen himself standing before Horus, had seen the Warmaster's claws tearing through his chest. But he did not run. He did not hide. He stood on the walls of the Imperial Palace and waited for the storm. The traitor fleet arrived. Ships beyond counting, vast battleships and cruisers, transports filled with traitors and demons and cultists, all descending on Terra like locusts. The void above the throne world lit up with the fire of 1,000 battles. Imperial ships fought desperately to hold back the tide, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and one by one they were destroyed. The traitors made planetfall, and the siege began. Armies clashed on the surface, artillery bombardments tore through the hive cities, and the sky above Terra turned black with smoke and ash. This was the final battle, the culmination of years of war, and the fate of the galaxy hung in the balance. Inside the palace, the Emperor prepared for the inevitable. He could not leave, not yet. The webway beneath the palace had been breached, and demons poured through the rift. If he abandoned his post, if he ceased his psychic labor for even a moment, the demons would flood into Terra and consume everything. And so he sat upon the golden throne, the device that sustained his efforts, and he held the line. But he knew that Horus would not stop. The Warmaster would break through eventually, would fight his way to the throne room, and then the Emperor would have to face his most beloved son in single combat. And the Emperor, for all his power, did not know if he could bring himself to kill Horus. The siege dragged on. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The loyalists fought with everything they had, but the traitors were relentless. The walls were breached, then repaired, then breached again. Entire districts of the palace fell, and the defenders were forced to retreat deeper inside. Sanguinius fought like a man possessed, his blade carving through traitor marines and demons alike, but even he could not be everywhere at once. And then, at the height of the battle, Horus made his move. He lowered the void shields on his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, and issued a challenge. The Emperor could end this now. Come to the ship. Face him. Decide the fate of the galaxy in single combat. It was a trap. Everyone knew it was a trap. But the Emperor had no choice. He teleported aboard the Vengeful Spirit, along with Sanguinius and Robaldorn. They fought their way through corridors filled with horrors, through warp-twisted nightmares and traitor marines driven mad by the touch of chaos. Sanguinius reached Horus first. He stood before the Warmaster, his brother, the one he had once called friend, and he begged him to stop. But Horus was beyond redemption. The Chaos Gods had claimed him, body and soul, and he struck Sanguinius down without hesitation. The angel fell, his wings broken, his blood pooling on the deck, and the Emperor arrived just in time to see his most beloved son die. The Emperor faced Horus. Father and son. Creator and betrayer. For a moment, the Emperor hesitated. He saw the boy he had raised, the son he had loved, and he could not bring himself to deliver the killing blow. But Horus felt no such hesitation. Empowered by the Chaos Gods, he struck the Emperor down, tearing through his armor, shattering his body. The Emperor fell, and for a heartbeat, the galaxy held its breath. But then, a single Imperial guardsman, a nameless soldier whose courage defied all reason, stepped between the Emperor and Horus. He raised his lost gun and fired, and though the shot did nothing, though Horus obliterated him in an instant, the act of defiance broke something inside the Emperor. He saw that even the smallest human, the weakest mortal, could resist chaos. And if they could resist, then Horus could have resisted too. The Emperor unleashed his full power. Psychic fire consumed Horus, obliterating him utterly, erasing his soul so completely that even the Chaos Gods could not claim it. The traitors fled. Without Horus, without their Warmaster, the rebellion collapsed. They retreated into the warp, into the Eye of Terror, and the Siege of Terra was over. But the cost had been unimaginable. The Emperor, shattered and dying, was placed upon the golden throne, where he has sat for 10,000 years, neither alive nor dead, holding back the demons and guiding humanity through the darkness. The Imperium survived, but the dream died. The age of the Great Crusade, the age of unity and hope, was over. And in its place came an age of stagnation, of superstition, of endless war. The Horus Heresy had ended, but its wounds would never heal.